So this is lecture 6 of How the Bible Became the Bible by Rabbi Lawrence Troster at Kesher Israel in Westchester, Pennsylvania. And tonight we're going to look at the Hebrew Bible and archaeological sources. In other words, how can we look to archaeology to help us understand the Bible? I'm not going to say prove the Bible, but rather we learn a lot from archaeological sources, the cultural setting of the Bible, as well as some very important historical events, some cultural events, and also understanding that the Bible was written by a literate elite. Archaeological evidence can tell us a lot about the average life of the Israelites and even about their religion that doesn't necessarily accord with what it says in the Bible, okay? And that's another course. In other words, there's another course I could teach on the religions of ancient Israel, meaning there is more than one sort of trend in ancient Israel. We saw that with the sources, but there's more than that, in the sense there is, what evidence do we have for popular religion, both from the Bible and from archaeology? So tonight, when we look at archaeological sources, first of all, we have Israelite sources. And Israelite sources found in the area that was ancient Israel include inscriptions, material and cultural artifacts, you name it, jewelry, pots and pans, religious material. I'll show you a picture of an altar from Megiddo, all those kinds of things. And Israelite sites themselves, towns and cities that show the evidence of Israelite occupation. And they can definitely tell the difference between Israelite occupation and what came before, because these towns were often around for a long time before the Israelites were, by a variety of things, carbon dating, but also style of pottery, and a few other things as well that distinguish Israelite sites from previous peoples or non-Israelite towns in we consider the area of the land of Israel. So that's the first material we're going to look at. Most important are the inscriptions, of which many have been found, actually. You don't have the kind of thing you find in ancient Egypt because of the climate in ancient Egypt. There's a lot of papyri that have been preserved from ancient Egypt that are thousands of years old. The Israelites didn't write on papyri, and parchment doesn't last that long because you don't have the same kind of dry weather for most of the country that you do in Egypt. So manuscripts are almost non-existent. What you have are inscriptions on stone, on pottery, and a variety of other things like that. So the non-Israelite sources are inscriptions mentioning Bible personalities, inscriptions with relevance to biblical texts, as you will see, material and cultural artifacts that give us a greater sense of understanding the cultures of that time, and sites mentioned or relevant to biblical text or Israelite history. In other words, like Babylon, right, or Nineveh, or other places which had an impact on ancient Israel. And some that you don't see mentioned in the Bible, but nonetheless are part of the cultural milieu of what is called Northwest Semitic. In other words, there is a civilization, it's linguistically distinct, which covers what we would call today Israel, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, parts of Turkey. That whole area is referred to as Northwest Semitic, and the languages are all interrelated. Southeast Semitic is Mesopotamia, and that's a different cultural and different linguistic milieu, even though they're closely related, okay? So those are the kinds of materials, and we're going to start with the Israelite sources. Now, what I've given you in your material are the translations of many of these texts. I'm going to show you the original, what it looks like, and then we can look at the translation. Anybody have any questions at this point before we move on? Okay, so again, I've given you a couple of maps so you can see where some of these locations are. This is a map of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah in the period where most of the material has been found. So some of the sites are on the map, so you'll be able to see where we're talking about. The other map gives you not only the way in which the exiles from the kingdoms of Israel and Judah go on, but also a little bit of the geography. And you'll notice what we have is called the Fertile Crescent, where from the Persian Gulf in an arc through Mesopotamia, through Syria, down the Mediterranean coast into Egypt, that's the fertile area. The part that is in the middle is pure desert and is often called the empty land. And so people didn't go there, and they certainly didn't live there. Okay? So here's the first thing I wanted to point out to you. This is an aerial view of Khirbet Qeiyafa, I think I'm pronouncing it correct, which is an Israelite site from the 11th century BCE. It's one of the oldest Israelite towns that have been found. This was found relatively recently, and for that period of time, it's quite large. And it's on the border between what would become Judea and the Philistines. And as you can see from the date, it dates back to the time of King David. Now, there's a lot of argument in scholarly circles as to whether David and Solomon actually existed in the way they're portrayed in the Bible. Maybe they were just some tribal chieftains, but this has proven them wrong. This is a significant fortress with a palace and all kinds of things that dates from the time of David and Solomon, and definitely shows the fact of a large government that would have to be able to do this. Now, found at this site, at Khirbet Qeiyafa, is the earliest Hebrew inscription we have that we can recognize as distinctly Hebrew. You have to understand there is a transition from language that has been found which is before Hebrew, which is sort of also connected to Canaanite, and Hebrew as a distinctive language. So this is the oldest that we have. So what is it? Well, as I said, it's not unusual for the people in the area of Eretz Yisrael to write on pottery. It's cheap, right? You have broken pots, and then you use them for letters. So these are called ostraka from the Greek, because the Greeks used to do the same thing. And this, here it is. And so what does this say? Well, here I've given it to you, and it's a really fascinating text, which has resonance in the Bible itself. So the translation has the lines numbered, so you can see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines that are there. They've managed to transcribe, and this is a very early Hebrew alphabet. And what does it say? You shall not do it, but worship the Lord. Judge the slave and the widow, judge the orphan and the stranger, plead for the infant, plead for the poor and the widow, rehabilitate the poor at the hands of the king, protect the poor and the slave, and support the stranger. Sound familiar? Well, that's what I've given you there, that if you go to Exodus 23:3 or Isaiah or Psalms, you're going to find language that is virtually identical. So here it is, a text from the 10th century BCE that is using idioms and ideas that are found in later biblical texts. So this is quite fascinating, and when this was discovered, people got pretty excited about it because not only of the dating of it, but also of the content. Anybody have any questions about this? Yes, Bert.
Go back to the previous slide. How did they tell that this was early Hebrew?
Because of the lithography and comparing it with earlier alphabets, which are Canaanite, they could tell, and then later Hebrew, they could tell that this is early Hebrew. Sometimes it's not so easy, by the way. Is it Canaanite? Is it Hebrew? Is not so easy. But this they could definitively prove that it was found in an Israelite setting, in an Israelite milieu, and therefore it's Hebrew.
there's nothing that I would say that any of us could recognize.
No.
In Hebrew we would know.
Because it's the archaic Hebrew alphabet, right? We talked about that in earlier, how there was a transition away from the original Hebrew alphabet to the Aramaic alphabet, but this is a very early version of the original Hebrew alphabet.
So someone would have had to take in this alphabet, included it was Hebrew, and play it forward to compare it to other Hebrew in order to be able to translate it?
Yeah, in other words, scholars know how to read ancient Hebrew script. So then they can sound it out and they know that it is Hebrew. You have to understand, a lot of the languages in that area, they're virtually identical. There's not a big difference between Canaanite and Hebrew, or Moabite and Hebrew, or Edomite and Hebrew. They're very, very similar. Very similar. Yes?
Which is the older language that they all developed from?
What they tend to call a Proto-Northwest Semitic. In other words, from that you get Phoenician, you get Canaanite, you get a whole variety, you get Ugaritic, which is a form of Canaanite, Phoenician is a form of Canaanite. You get all of these languages which are very closely related. No, this is Semitic. This is all Semitic. In other words, there's four major Semitic areas. One is Northwest Semitic, one is Southeast Semitic, one is Southwest Semitic, that's where Arabic comes from. And so there's some Proto-Semitic that's at the heart of all those, has nothing to do with Indo-European. Okay, yeah, Dan.
Do you have Kiafa on this map?
No, but it's sort of on the border where we would now call, I'm not sure, let me just take a quick look here.
See, Gezer is on it.
Yeah, it's Gezer. Yeah, it would sort of be, I think it's around there. Okay? It's southwest, definitely. Okay, so here is another ancient text that is very early, 10th century BCE, and this is called the Gezer calendar. Gezer, which is on your map, was an Israelite town near the border with the Philistines, and this stone was found quite a while ago, and nobody knows exactly what it is. It could be a scribe just doing this as a writing exercise. It could be a kid who is practicing writing, but it appears to be a calendar, or at least talks about the seasons, and that's why it's called the Gezer calendar. And so this is what it says in Hebrew, and the last is the name of the person who wrote it, somebody named Aviyah. And because it's got Yah in it, which is from Yud He Vav He, it's definitely Israelite, because you don't find any Canaanites with that kind of name. And so notice what it says: 2 months of harvest, 2 months of planting, 2 months are late planting, 2 months of hoeing, 1 month of barley harvest, 1 month of harvest and festival, 2 months of grape harvesting, 1 month of summer fruit. Okay, so again, there's a lot of scholarly arguments over what exactly this is talking about, and what kind of calendar were they using, and what is its relationship to the later Jewish calendar. It's very hard to tell. It may be a fall calendar like we're using now, or it could be, there's a possibility it could be a spring one as well, which is what the Torah has. So it's not really clear exactly what it is, but it's really old. Okay, so here's something else that I didn't give you because I only found out about it recently. This is a piece of a pot that would, well, actually a jar. It would have been a large jar for holding wine. It was found in the Ophel, which is the part of Jerusalem that is the oldest part of ancient Jerusalem, what is referred to as the City of David. And so it was the top of a wine jug or jar, and it had on it kind of where it came from and when it was made. It's not unusual to find pottery with who it belongs to written on it, and this one, again, is extremely old, 10th century BCE, again, from the time of David and Solomon, from Jerusalem itself. It's not Canaanite or Jebusite, because the Jebusites were the ones who were in Jerusalem before the Israelites. It says, and again, part of this is heavily reconstructed and disagreed with by scholars, in the regnal year, meaning the so-and-so year of the king, first month, smooth wine from the garden of. Must have been pretty good. Okay, so this is a significant find, and then again, there's a lot of arguments over what it says and trying to, how it's spelt, but it's a very old text. Okay, here is one of the most fascinating texts that were found in the last half century. There is a place almost on the border between Israel and Egypt called Kuntilat Ashrud. Now, when the Israelis occupied the Sinai Desert, they did a lot of archaeological surveys, and Kuntilat Ashrud was one of the places that they excavated. And it was right on the border, so when Israel gave back the Sinai to Egypt, they had to give back everything they found, which is now probably sitting in a basement in the Cairo Museum. And one of the most important finds was this. A pithos is a kind of pot, and they found on this one, this is of course not the thing itself, but a sort of a taking away from it. If you actually looked at pictures of the piece itself, you really can't see very much. And it is really unusual because it depending upon how you translate it, it seems to be a quasi-Israelite pagan thing. For one thing, on the right, what you have is the tree of life. This is the earliest depiction from an Israelite perspective of the tree of life. You see the animals are drinking from it. Okay? What's really weird is on the left. And it appears to have two male figures, or not, and a female figure in the back, or not. And the inscription, which is in really old Hebrew, in a very difficult script, talks about Yud-He Vav-He of Shomron, of Samaria, and it can be translated as, and his Asherah. What does that mean? Is it his wife? Is it, who knows? This has been argued over ever since it's been found, and nobody's come to conclusions other than it's very old. And it could be one of those things where there is a kind of borderline between, this is where you get into the popular religion thing I was talking about. Maybe there were Israelites who believed that God had a consort, had a wife. And there are people who have made the theory about this and have attempted to do it. Yes, we're recording this,
Well, okay, I'll still say it, okay?
Yeah.
This is Rabbi Kravitz saying this, sitting next to Maury Gold, okay? If I may be so bold in this mature audience to say this, is that looking at this, when I look at that tree, you tell me, Dr. Gold, there is sort of a female imagery going here to me. Am I wrong? I mean, just kind of...
Well, we don't know. We don't know.
The ovary, you know what I'm talking
Well,
about?
the notion of a cosmic tree is very ancient and doesn't originate in ancient Israel. Okay? But the question is this talking about, or does Asherah mean somebody else, and does that figure in the back isn't a woman? We're not 100% sure. This is the second one, and it refers to Yud-He Vav-He of Teman and his Asherah. Now, Shomron is in the north, right? Samaria. What's it doing down here in the Negev? And Teman is further south. It's on the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. So these are very mysterious, but it probably comes, there was some kind of sanctuary there, and it probably comes out of a more popular religion. The problem is there isn't a lot of proof otherwise of the Israelites worshiping a consort to God. It's really a very difficult thing to establish definitively. Okay? But this is very interesting stuff. So here's an example of some of the material things that have been found. Megiddo was an important town long before it was an Israelite. And if you look at your map, you'll see Megiddo is, if you look on the coast, you see a town called Dor, and if you go directly right from there, you'll see Megiddo. Megiddo is at the entrance to a pass that goes through the mountains, the hills, that takes you through the Galilee to up towards Damascus. So it is an incredibly strategic point, and there have been a town there for thousands of years, and fortresses, and constantly getting conquered by one group or another and being destroyed. And the mountain nearby is the mountain of Megiddo, which in Hebrew is Har Megiddo, which is where we get our word Armageddon from, because it is a place of battles, and there is a Israelite occupation level. The Israelites built a water tunnel there to make sure that they could get water in times of siege. And one of the things they found there was a small altar with horns on it. And the altars in the Hebrew Bible that are mentioned all are said to have horns. This is a very old idea. It's a small altar, which means it's probably an incense altar. It's too small for animal sacrifice. But they have found Israelite altars and shrines all across the country. Okay? Here is one of the most famous inscriptions that was found. This was before the state of Israel existed, and in fact, this is in the museum in Istanbul, and it's called the Shiloam inscription. Many of you have been to Jerusalem, and you've been to Hezekiah's water tunnel, I'm sure. You may have walked through it. I have. When they found Hezekiah's water tunnel, modern, they found this stone in there that has an inscription from the time of King Hezekiah. Now, the water tunnel is actually mentioned in the Bible, and so they know that this is from Hezekiah, and it confirms what it says in the Bible about Hezekiah protecting the source of water for Jerusalem, because this goes to the Shiloam spring. So they were able to have a tunnel so they could go down and get water in times of siege. So this is what it looks like in the Paleo-Hebrew script. When you transpose it into modern Hebrew letters, that's what it looks like underneath. And I've given you the translation. And evidently, it's a stone that tells you how they built the tunnel. Now, if any of you have been in the tunnel, you actually can see where the workmen chopped in the walls. But this is what it says. This tunnel, and this is the story of the tunnel. Of course, it's fragmentary. While the axes were against each other, and while 3 cubits were left to cut, the voice of a man called to his counterpart. For there was Zada in the rock. We don't know that. And on the right and on the day of the tunnel being finished, the stone cutters, each man struck towards his counterpart, axe against axe, and flowed water from the source to the pool for 1,200 cubits. And 100 cubits was the height over the head of the stone cutters. So you can see how they were cutting from 2 ends, and they were calling to each other so they could hear where to cut. Now, the tunnel is not straight. It kind of goes like this, and there's even a place where it's evident that it was at the wrong height and they had to cut it down because they were going to, kind of go miss each other. But this is fascinating that here you have this inscription of something that is, in fact, mentioned in the Bible from the 7th century, beginning of the 8th. Actually, it's a little earlier than that, late 8th century BCE. Yeah.
It's quite an engineering marvel to be able to start at that distance from 2 points.
Yes.
And
Yes.
almost.
And it wasn't the only one. There's one at Megiddo, and there's one at Hatzor in the north as well. So it was a technology that was well known. And in fact, it's evident that they were building, that there was a previous tunnel or some other kind of thing that was done by the Jebusites. So they were improving on or creating something new, but this idea of protecting your water source by digging a tunnel to it was not something they invented. Okay? What?
Why is that inscription in Istanbul?
Because it was found during the Ottoman period, and it was taken to the museum there, and they don't want to give it back. Okay. All right, one of the other fascinating things that was found, again, there are Israelite shrines that was found, but in the town of Arad, which is in the northern Negev, which you can, I think it's on the map, maybe not. Arad was a fortress town in the period of the Kingdom of Judea, and in the town was a temple to God. They found the temple, and this is what the Holy of Holies looks like. You see there are two columns to the entrance, which is like the two columns at the entrance to the temple in Solomon's temple that's described in the first book of Kings. And the way it's laid out is a mini version of what the temple in Jerusalem would have looked like. One of the fascinating things about it, though, is that at the very back of the Holy of Holies, you see two blank stelae. What does that mean? Are they meant to represent God and his consort? Are they meant to represent God and what? We don't know. What we do know is that during the Deuteronomic reform of King Josiah, when the local shrines and temples were cut down, this temple was destroyed by the Judeans themselves because they felt that it was not monotheistic enough, or because the Deuteronomic people said you can't have any other temples except in Jerusalem, and that's what King Josiah did. Now, one of the other things that they have found in Arad are letters written on pottery, the ostraca. So here is one that was written, which I don't think I gave you the text of this one. No. It's from the commander of the fort to somebody else. And look what it says. To my lord Eliashib, may Yud-He Vav-He be solicitous concerning your welfare. Back then they didn't care about pronouncing the divine name. That was a later thing when people stopped pronouncing it. Now then, give Shemaryahu, and that name Shemaryahu does appear in the Hebrew Bible, although not necessarily this guy. We don't know what that is. And to Karasoi give a Homer. And as for the matter you instructed me about, the house of Yud-He Vav-He as well, it endures. That's referring to the temple in Jerusalem. So here we have one, I think it's the earliest mention of the temple in Jerusalem. And they found, there's a bunch of these that came out of Arad. Here's another one that is quite fascinating, found at a place called Mazad Hashavyahu. It's an ostracon, and I've given you the text here. And again, it seems to be a letter from addressed to the commander of the fortress, because this again is a border town. And look what it says. Let my lord commander hear the case of his servant. As for your servant was harvesting at Hazar Susim, and your servant was still harvesting as they finished the storage of grain as usual before the Sabbath. Okay, what is this about? First of all, this is the oldest mention of Shabbat that we have. This man evidently was stopping his harvesting before Shabbat, and somehow somebody grabbed his harvest. And so he's writing, probably he didn't write it, probably a scribe did, writing this letter. It's an official complaint letter to the commander of the fortress to complain about how he'd been treated. But this is a fascinating inscription, isn't it? Okay, any questions at this point? So here is an amazing find. This was found in a First Temple cemetery not far from Jerusalem, and it's called Ketef Chinom. 2 little silver scrolls that were buried with somebody. So they're kind of like amulets, probably. What's interesting about them is what's written on them. Here's the smaller one. And here's the translations of them. Take a look at it. Tell me what it reminds you of. If you take a look, it's especially, this is the first one. Look at the last few lines. It's the priestly blessing. And the second one also has it. This is the earliest mention we have of a biblical text. And it's evident that in this period of time, and it's been dated to around 600 BCE, the Kohanic blessing, which is found in the book of Numbers, was already seen as a piece of liturgy. Yeah.
But now, they could have had that liturgy much earlier.
Yes.
But we don't have any, I mean, what surprises me is how late it is.
Well, it depends on, how do you date the original text that's in Numbers? We're not sure. The book of Numbers was probably edited after this. But the fact is that for Israelite text, this is pretty early. And of course, what was it doing being put into a grave is also an interesting issue. The Torah seems to be not talking about it much, but seems to be against the idea of ancestor worship or people living on in some kind of way after their death. But Israelite graves seems to show that, on the contrary, people believed in some kind of afterlife in which they actually fed their ancestors. Here is, to me, a couple of the most fascinating things from a historical perspective. These are what are called bullae, a bulla in singular. What it is that people didn't sign their names to documents. What they would do is they would roll the parchment up and they would put clay on it to seal the document, and then a person would have a ring or a stamp with their name on it that they would push into the clay and it would harden. Now, these bullae were found in, at least the one on the right, were found in houses that were destroyed when the first temple was destroyed. The fire burned up the paper, but it baked the clay. So now they're hard. The one on the left appeared on the antiquities market, so nobody's 100% sure where it comes from. That's a problem. But nonetheless, they've examined it and found that it's authentic, because there's always a problem of fakes. The one on the left is from Baruch ben Neriah. Who is Baruch ben Neriah? He was Jeremiah's secretary and the person who probably wrote the book of Jeremiah. Not only is his name on this, but his fingerprint is on it. The one on the right is from a guy named Gemaryahu ben Shaphan. Gemaryahu ben Shaphan is mentioned in the book of Jeremiah. And here it is. It's during the time of the last decades of the kingdom of Judah. And then it says, in the hearing of all the people, this is verse 10, Baruch read the words of Jeremiah from the scroll. That's the first edition of the book of Jeremiah. Baruch reads it out to everybody. In the house of the Lord, in the chamber of Gemaryahu, son of Shaphan, the scribe. Okay? And the Shaphan family was we found other inscriptions that refer to the Shaphan family. They're mentioned in the Bible. They evidently were a family of scribes, therefore high-level bureaucrats in the royal administrations. And there have been other bullae that have been found that also mention other people who are in the book of Jeremiah. Here's one of the most fascinating bullae that have ever been found of King Ahaz, one of the kings of Judea, from an earlier century than the ones we just saw. I mean, this is incredible when they found it. It's got his name on it. It's the royal seal. Here's another one. A guy named Shema, who was the servant of King Jeroboam II. It was found at Megiddo. Jeroboam II was the king of the northern kingdom in the 8th century, at the time of Amos and Isaiah and Hosea. And this was one of his main officials. Okay, Any questions at this point? So, there is a town, and it's on the map, called Lachish. If you take a look on the map, it's right near the border with Philistia. You see it? If you go straight north of Beersheba, you will see Lachish. Lachish was a very, very important Judean town. It was strategically really important because it was close to the border with the Philistines, and it also helped to control traffic into Judea and also north-south. So it had a very large fortress there. And one of the things that was found were a whole bunch of letters from Lachish, written, again, on pottery. So if you take a look, I've given you the text of this letter, and it apparently, again, is from somebody to the commander of the fortress. To my lord Yahush, Yud He Vav He, give my lord to see the present season in good health. What is your servant but a dog, that my lord has sent the letter of the king and the letters of the officials, saying, read this and see how the words of the prophet are not good, liable to loose your hands and to make limp the hands of the men. In other words, evidently the commander sent this guy a letter complaining about something, and he's writing back saying, why are you complaining, essentially? And now, my lord, will you not write to them and say, why do you behave like this, and in Jerusalem too? Look, it is to the king and to his house that you are doing this thing. By the life of Yud He Vav He, I tell you that since your servant read the letters, there's not been for your servant peace. There's some kind of internal thing going on here. Okay? Yes, Dan?
No, those are not impressed in clay.
No.
Are those written in what kind of ink?
Ink. Some kind of ink. Yeah.
Because that's lasted a long time.
Yes, it has. But as you can see, when you look at the left, it's very hard to read it, so they have to take pictures of it in certain ways to be able to transcribe it. And that's why I gave you what it looks like when you do that. Okay. So here is this is something I've only heard about recently. This is now, and actually what we're going to be doing is we're now going to be going to sources that are not Israelite, but pertain to Israelites and Judeans from other cultures. Okay? But this particular thing was found in Mesopotamia. It was part of an archive of a particular family of Judeans who had been exiled to Babylon by the Babylonians. So, and it was from a place called Al-Yehudu, the village of the Judeans, or as one commentator called it, Jewtown. Okay? This came from one of the places where the people, when they were exiled from Judea in Babylon, and the language is, it's written in Babylonian cuneiform, but the language is a bit of mixture between the local language and some Hebrew, apparently. And it talks about the day-to-day life. These are business and family documents. And there's a whole bunch of them. And recently, I think last year, they published a book which has an edition of it and translation of all of them. It's an amazing, amazing thing. It's one of the few sources we have for the early history of the Jews in Mesopotamia. Okay? Okay, so when we look at sources that have relevance to the Bible, one of the most important is the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation epic. This is what the tablets look like. And here is the beginning of the Babylonian creation story. Take a look what it says. When there was no heaven, no earth, no height, no depth, no name, when Apsu was alone, the sweet water, the first begetter, and Tiamat, the bitter water, and that returned to her womb, her mumu, when there were no gods, when sweet and bitter mingled together, no reed was plaited, no rushes muddied the waters. The gods were nameless, natureless, futureless. Then from Apsu and Tiamat in the waters, gods were created. In the waters, silt precipitated. It sounds like Genesis 1, doesn't it? There is primordial chaos represented by Apsu and Tiamat. And the gods don't even exist yet. And out of this primordial chaos comes order. This is just the beginning of it. There are huge differences between the Enuma Elish and Genesis. But this is the backdrop of the Israelite creation stories. There are several non-Israelite creation epics that you find resonance in the Hebrew Bible. Not just Genesis 1 or Genesis 2, but there's evidence of other Israelite creation stories in the Hebrew Bible, in the Psalms, in Isaiah, that are closer to the Canaanite and the Babylonian creation stories in their structure. Even though they're not pagan and they're not polytheistic, they are monotheistic, but they are much more similar than you would think. Okay? Here is 3 versions of the flood story. So what you have in the middle is the most well-known from a text from Babylon called the Gilgamesh epic. Now, Gilgamesh was an actual king of ancient Babylon, or Mesopotamia, and he became a legendary figure, and there was a story written about him, and he goes through all various adventures and various other things, and in the process, he runs into the Babylonian Noah, who tells him the story of the flood. Now, there are 2 other versions of the Mesopotamian flood story. You have the Atrahasis epic, which comes from the 17th century BCE, and one that's even a little earlier, the Eridu, which means Genesis essentially, the Sumerian creation epic. And the Sumerians were non-Semitic people that preceded the Babylonians and the Assyrians and everybody else. And the creation stories are very similar, but the one that is most well known is the one in the Gilgamesh epic. And if you take a look at it, Gilgamesh meets this guy called Utnapishtim. He is the Babylonian Noah. And he's telling Gilgamesh what happened. Okay? And what happened was that essentially he talks about how the gods are there, and the gods have decided that humans are too noisy, and they decide to get rid of them. But one of the gods goes to Utnapishtim and tells him, take a look, tear down the house and build a boat, abandon wealth and seek living beings, spurn possession and keep alive living beings, make all living beings go up into the boat which you are to build. The dimensions must measure equal to each other, its length must correspond to its width, roof it over like the Apsu. And so here's this guy, he's being given the command by the god to build an ark, take all different kinds of life into it, and then the flood comes. 6 days and 7 nights came the wind and the flood, the storm flattening the land. When the 7th day arrived, the storm was pounding, and so on and so forth. And it talks about how he's inside the ark, and he's terrified, and he opens up a window to get fresh air, and he looks outside, and he realizes the whole earth has been covered with water. And then if you take a look at the latter part of it, he talks about how they're there, and the water's still there. And then when it says, when the 7th day arrived, Mount Nemosh held the boat, allowing no sway, meaning it settled on the top of a mountain, like in the Noah story on Mount Ararat. When the 7th day arrived, I sent forth a dove and released it, like Noah does. The dove went off, but came back to me. Just like in the Noah story, the dove comes back. And then he sends forth a swallow, and the swallow comes back. He sends forth a raven, and the raven does not come back. And then, when the water subsided, what does he do? I offered incense in front of the mountain Ziggurat. 7 and 7 cult vessels I put in place. So he does a sacrifice. That's exactly what Noah does when he gets out of the ark. But notice that the last part is really funny. The god smelled the sweet savor, and collected like flies over a sheep sacrifice. The gods realized they made a big mistake and they were starving because they needed humans to feed them. Anybody have any questions or comments at this point? Yes, Bert.
Why is our story so different? Not so different, but constructed different. Clearly, the authors, maybe it was, assuming there was a great flood, and from that flood, various authors constructed a story, but ours is different.
Yes.
What do our scholars tell us why it was so different?
Well, first of all, it's monotheistic. I mean, why is the Genesis... Remember, there are two creation stories in Genesis that have been edited together. So first of all, it's monotheistic. So what happened is that very often it seems that there was this idea of a flood that was floating around the ancient Near East. Floating, sorry about that. In other words, it was a common story to everybody that there had once been a flood that covered the earth, and there was a guy who managed to survive by building a boat. Okay? So the Israelites had this story that preceded them. I mean, these texts are much older than anything we have in the Bible. Okay? So, but when they finally, they created their version of it, it's monotheistic. And secondly, the rationale for the flood is radically different. The rationale for the flood in the Noah story is that the earth is filled with violence. It's not that God is getting, oh, people are too noisy, I can't stand it up here in heaven, you're keeping me up at night. It's a morality tale in our Torah. That is the biggest difference. And so, again, you see in the biblical texts a moral core to a lot of these things. And that's the biggest difference. I mean, the similarities are fascinating, but you cannot emphasize the whole reason for the story is completely different. Yes, Thelma.
So is there any evidence of it in any religions that have survived except ours and Christianity from us?
And Islam. That has a flood story?
Yeah.
Well, the ancient Greeks had a flood story, but they probably got it from the Mesopotamians. All right. In other words, any flood story that now exists, and there are flood stories now amongst Native Americans, but they probably got it from Europeans, it all comes from the biblical flood story because the other ancient cultures that had these stories didn't survive. And as far as I know, there's no flood stories in India or China. I'm not 100% sure, but I've never heard of any. It's very much something that comes out of the ancient Near East and spreads west. Okay? So, one of the most remarkable things also, I keep saying that, but it's true, that was found was a stele, this is just the top of it that I'm showing you now, of King Hammurabi, who was a Babylonian king in the 18th century BCE, which means some 800 years before ancient Israel. And if you've ever been to the Louvre in Paris, that's where this is. And when you go up to it, it's about, this high, it's on a stand. And I remember seeing it and I was just like, wow, this is actually Hammurabi's code. And what is on this stele is a picture of Hammurabi. And he is giving his law. And so the stele is covered in laws. And when you look at the laws of Hammurabi, and you compare them to our earliest law code in the Torah, which is in the book of Exodus, chapters 21 to 23, there are laws that are virtually identical. There are differences. What does this show? Did the writers of the law code of the book of Exodus copy Hammurabi's code? No. It was part of the ancient Near Eastern common law. And take a look at some of them. Okay? It talks about false accusations, which we have in the Hebrew Bible. Look what it says if a builder builds a house for someone but doesn't construct it properly. All right? In other words, and take a look at the one, if a man, if a son strikes his father, his hand shall be hewn off. In the Bible, in the law codes in the Torah, a son who hits their parents is put to death. All right? Take a look at what it says. If anyone steals the minor son of another, that's kidnapping. The death is a punishment for kidnapping in Exodus. And this is, take a look at the one where it says, if a man strikes a pregnant woman, thereby causing her to miscarry and die, the assailant's daughter shall be put to death. Okay, leaving aside from the fact that they had this punishment where if your child, you killed somebody's child, then your child dies, which is not the biblical one. But notice in the book of Exodus, there is a discussion of what happens if two men are fighting and one of them hits a pregnant woman and she miscarries, but otherwise she doesn't get a mortal wound. So here again is this common law that has very similar things. Take a look at the one right after it. If a man puts out an eye of an equal, his eye shall be put out. In the Hammurabi Code, as in many of the Mesopotamian codes, your punishments depend on your social class. So if you're the lower, so in other words, class to class, the punishments are equal. Lower class to higher class, or higher class to lower class, they're not. They're different. And you take a look at several of these things, and they're very, very similar to the laws in Exodus. Anybody have any questions about this particular thing? Okay, so here's another example of something similar. This is an ancient Egyptian papyri, which comes from 1250 BCE. It's very old. And it has on it a text called the Wisdom of Amenemope. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. Now, this wisdom text has parallels in the book of Proverbs, which is edited hundreds of years later. So how did this happen? Because I've given you several examples where if you take a look, for example, at Proverbs 22, 17 to 18, incline your ear, hear the words of the wise, and apply your heart to my doctrine, for it is pleasant if you keep them in your belly, that they may be established together upon your lips. And from the wisdom of Amenemope, give your ear to what I say, apply to your heart to apprehend. It is good for you to place them in your heart. Let them rest in the casket of your belly. Each one you look at, they're virtually identical. So how did you get from this Egyptian text in 1250 BCE to the book of Proverbs that is edited around the year 500, 800 years? The answer is that this Egyptian text was probably translated from ancient Egyptian into Aramaic. And in the Aramaic version, it was well known. This is a characteristic of wisdom literature in the ancient Near East, that different cultures traded wisdom literature, that it wasn't so national or particular. And that's why you will find this ancient Egyptian text has all these, the book of Proverbs, there's a chunk of the book of Proverbs that is a direct quotation from this Egyptian text, even though they didn't know it. They just thought they were picking something up from an Aramaic text. Okay, we're going back a little further. These are what are called two of the Tel Amarna letters. Tel Amarna, Amarna was the capital of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, who lived in the 14th century BCE. This is before the Israelites, before the Exodus, before the occupation. And he was a monotheist. He reformed Egyptian religion to only worship the sun god Aten. When he died, the priests of the other gods sort of rebelled back and the whole thing was lost. And his city was destroyed. But when the city was excavated, they found all of these letters. They are letters from and to the king, to his vassals who lived in the area of what was then Canaan. So one in particular is extremely important. I mean, they're all fascinating because they're complaining about, they're getting attacked and things like that. But one of them is from a guy who is an official of the city of Gezer, and his name is Yapahu, and he's writing the king to complain that they are being attacked by a group of people called the Apiru, who seem to be some kind of nomadic tribes that are coming to attack them. Does that sound odd to you, Hapiru? It sounds like Hebrew. Ever since this was found, people have tried to find out, were the Hapiru proto-Israelites or not? They might have been. They might have been the ancestors of the Israelites. And there may be a connection between, the term Hebrew, Ivri, and Hapiru. We're not 100% sure. There's a lot of theories about also the relationship between Akhenaten's monotheism and later Israelite monotheism. Nobody can show a direct link. Okay, here is the Mesha stone. The Mesha stone is a Moabite stone. It is written in Moabite, which is virtually identical to biblical Hebrew. It's written in a very similar alphabet. In fact, on the right there, they've transposed it into modern Hebrew script. And lines 17 and 18 are the last part of what I've given you. The beginning of it, the god Mesha is a king of Moab from around 840 BCE. He calls himself the son of Chemosh. Chemosh is the Moabite god. And Chemosh is mentioned in the Bible when the Israelites attacked the Moabites. And it talks about them and how, look what it says. Omri was the king of Israel, and he oppressed Moab for many days, for Chemosh was angry with his land. So the Moabites are giving the same reason for their oppression, by their being conquered by the Israelites, that the Israelites would give when they're conquered by a foreign people. Their God is angry with them. And then what happens is, but I look down on him in his house, and Israel has been defeated. It has been defeated forever. And I took from there the altar hearths of Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. That's what it says in line 18. Okay? And I dragged them before Chemosh. And the king of Israel built Jabez and dwelt in it while he fought with me, and Chemosh drove him out before them. And I took from Moab 200 men, all its chief, and I led them against Yahaz and took it to add unto Dibon. So this actually records a historical event that is alluded to in the Hebrew Bible, but not directly mentioned. That around 840 BCE, the Moabites, who had been under the rule of the northern kingdom of Israel, threw off Israelite rule. This is an inscription from the 8th century BCE, the Dir Allah inscription. It was found on a room. It was an inscription written on plaster. It's written in a kind of Proto-Aramaic. It's a very unusual language. The script is very similar to ancient Israelite, but also all the other Canaanite and so on. And it's very fragmentary. But what it mentions is Balaam. Balaam, who is a character in the book of Numbers, he is a foreign prophet who prophesies about Israel. It's where we get, how goodly are your tents, O Jacob. It was Balaam who said it. And the Balaam that is described in this description fits the description of the Balaam that's in the Bible. He is called a seer, which is what he is called in the Torah. He talks about how the God spoke to him at night in a vision. That's how Balaam gets his visions of God. And it's according to the oracle of El. El is the chief of the Canaanite pantheon. And the name El gets taken up by the Israelites to refer to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. And it talks about him, and we're not quite sure exactly what is going on here, but evidently it's something about some vision he had of the gods gathering together. It's very fragmentary. But this, of course, excited a lot of attention when it was discovered. That here is one of the first times that a character in an early part of the Bible from the time of Moses is mentioned in a non-Israelite inscription. Now, we actually have a series of historical inscriptions by Mesopotamian kings who conquered the area of Israel. So one of them is called the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, and I've given you the part that refers to Jehu, the son of Omri. That's one of the kings of northern Israel, and how he became a vassal to Shalmaneser III, and how he had to pay him tribute. This one is also from Shalmaneser III, and also refers to his conquests in the west. And here he is referring to King Ahab of Israel. So Ahab, of course, is a major figure in the first book of Kings. He's considered an evil king. You know, his wife Jezebel and all that stuff. He's mentioned in a Babylonian inscription. Here is the Tel Dan inscription, which was found in northern Israel in the excavation of the city of Dan. It's not an Israelite inscription. It seems to be of the Arameans of Damascus, and it's a victory inscription, how they conquered the Israelites. Evidently, the Israelites took this stone at some point and smashed it. But on it is a very significant thing. What you see here is the house of David. This is the earliest mention we have outside the Bible of King David. This is an alphabet which is virtually identical to ancient Hebrew. That's a bet, that's a yud, that's a taf, beit, house. That's a daled. It's a triangle. It looks like the Greek delta. This is a vav, and this is a daled. So here is the mention of the descendants of King David, the royal family of Judea, in a non-Israelite text. And it's referring to one of the kings of the not only of Israel, Ahab, but also one of the king of Judea. All right? Any questions at this point? You're all sitting there amazed, right? Yeah.
Are most of these antiquities in the Israel Museum?
No, they're all over the place because, well, this one is, but there are things that are in museums in Jordan, in Istanbul, in Damascus, in Baghdad. I don't know whether they still exist, but you know, they're here in Philadelphia. There is one of the largest collections of ancient Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets. All right, I mean, unbelievable stuff there. They're in museums all over the world. Okay, so here is another stele, an Assyrian one from 797, and it mentions King Joash of Israel as somebody he conquered. This one is called the Nimrud Prism from 720 BCE, from the town of Nimrud, and it mentions the deportations of the northern Israelites by the Assyrian king Sargon. Here's another one. This is Sennacherib, who is also an Assyrian king. This dates from around 700, and I've given you the text on it. It talks about Hezekiah, the king Hezekiah. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, Hezekiah fights off Sennacherib in a miraculous way. But in fact, archaeologically, we know that Hezekiah even though Jerusalem was not conquered, the rest of his country got pretty beaten up, and he was forced, in effect, to knuckle under to the Assyrians. And this is the stele where Sennacherib describes what he does. It talks about he lays siege to 40, it could be exaggerated a bit, but, and how do we know that this is the case? Well, archaeology proves it, but also one of the most fascinating finds that we have is from Sennacherib's palace. These are called the Lachish reliefs. They were found at Nineveh by the British, and they were taken back to the British Museum. They're in the British Museum. Here's what they look like. They are pictures of Sennacherib's siege of the Judean town, city, fortress town of Lachish. Here's a kind of transcription of it, a part of it. This is the towers of the city. Here are the Assyrians coming with siege ramps and towers and attacking the Judeans. These are Judeans, our ancestors, fighting off. Here's a detail of the Judeans fighting from the top of the tower. These are all kinds of arrows and things coming down on them. Here are archers from the Assyrians shooting up at them. Here are Assyrian troops marching along. You have to understand, the Assyrian army was the biggest and best in the ancient world at this time. They rolled over everybody, essentially. This shows the aftermath of the battle. In other words, the Lachish relief shows the battle and its aftermath all in one series of pictures. These are the bodies of people they killed being hoisted on stakes. Here are Judeans who are being carried off into captivity. That's them here, and here, and there. Here is King Sennacherib taking tribute. Here are, again, Judeans going into exile. These are women and these are children. Here are Judeans bowing down in captivity. This is a replica of part of one of the things. Again, these are all, you see the women and children, and they're carrying off all these treasures, the Assyrian soldiers. So this is one of the most poignant things that we have that actually shows our ancestors being carried off into captivity, not to Babylon, to Assyria. Okay, just a few more. Okay? This is called the Babylonian Chronicle, found in Babylon, and it talks about Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, besieging Jerusalem in 597. You see, there were set two sieges. The first siege was in 597. The city was not destroyed in the first siege. But what does he say? He, Nebuchadnezzar, encamped against the city of Judah, Jerusalem, and on the second day of Adar, because the months that we use now, the names are Babylonian names, by the way. So the month of Adar, he seized the city and seized the king. That was Jehoiakim. And appointed a king of his own pleasure over it. He took tribute and conveyed it back. Now, who was the king he put in place? Jehoiakim's brother, Zedekiah. This is all in the Bible. It's laid out in the book of 2 Kings. But this was the actual chronicle that the Babylonians themselves made a record of. Now, one of the other interesting things is that amongst all these various things, they found several of ration lists, meaning who was Nebuchadnezzar supporting with food and, food and water and boarding and whatever. Well, one of the people that's mentioned is Jehoiakim, the king of Judah. When he was carried off to Babylon as a captive, he was kept in the royal court, and he and his family and his officials were fed by Nebuchadnezzar. They were hostages, but they were treated well because they were royal. And we know this, it says so in the Hebrew Bible. that this occurred in the second book of Kings. It mentions it, and here is the Babylonians mentioning it. Okay, now we're going to look at the earliest evidence we have for the Israelites. And it's an Egyptian text. On the left there, you see what's called the Merneptah stele, and it's quite large. And you see that it's got pictures on the top and this long text. King Merneptah was the son of Ramses II. And Ramses II, it's traditionally been that he was the pharaoh of the Exodus, or Merneptah was. The thing is, Merneptah, typically the Egyptians tried to control the area of Canaan to prevent any foreigners from Mesopotamia or from Asia Minor, what is now Turkey, coming down. And in fact, Merneptah's father, Ramses II, had fought a huge battle with the Hittites, who were in what we call southern Turkey today, at a place called Kadesh, which is in Lebanon. And there was a big battle of Kadesh, and it was an indecisive battle. And out of it came a treaty where the Hittites and the Egyptians drew a border. And we have copies of the Egyptian version of the treaty and Hittite version of the treaty. And we also have pictures that Ramses made on various walls of him leading his troops into battle. He claims it was a victory, but we also have the account from Hittites, and evidently it was a draw. So, his son, Merneptah, goes on a campaign into the area of Canaan, and he attacks a bunch of the cities to bring them under their control. And that's what the Merneptah stele is about. It's about his military campaign into Canaan, in the process of which, if you take a look at the text, he talks about all, the first part is, all those things of who he is and various things. And then he talks about all the towns that he conquered, and it says, the princes are prostrate saying shalom, peace. Not one of the 9 bows lifts his head. And then he lists all the places that he has conquered, including Ashkelon and Gezer and a place called Yanoam. And then it says, Israel is waste, bare of seed. That's what that close-up is. This here is Israel. This is the earliest inscription we have, the first mention of ancient Israel. And it dates from around when we would traditionally date the Exodus, which means by the late 13th century BCE, the Israelites were already occupying the hill countries of what we call now Judea and Samaria. Because the way the Egyptian text is written, that's what it suggests. It doesn't suggest a city like Ashkelon. It suggests tribes in the hills. And in fact, archaeological evidence of the villages of these early Israelites matches the Merneptah stele. So this is where it all starts. This is the beginning of our nation and the earliest evidence for it. And I've got one other thing to show you, which is really quite astounding. When Merneptah wrote this stele, he actually made more than one copy of it. But also, he went to the city of Karnak, and Karnak had been, great temples in Karnak were made by previous pharaohs. He decided to make a monumental inscription about his military victories that had been in them. So here is part of that monumental inscription, where he has pictures of his battles. And in it, he actually identifies which of the people he's attacking. This panel, unfortunately, has no direct attribution, but when you look at it closely, it would appear that these are Israelites. There's a scholar who in the last 10 years has theorized with a lot of good proof from the inscriptions that this is the battle in which he claims to have conquered the Israelites. And these are pictures of Israelites. So here it is, folks. Pictures of our ancestors in Karnak. There's another part of the inscription that's a close-up of the one that I just showed you. On your, in your sheets, I've given you another one that might be Israelites, but it may not be. It may be Bedouin. But the fact is, we actually have a picture of those first Israelites. So this is where we hit rock bottom. This is where we have dug down from the Torah in our ark down to the bedrock of where it all began. It all began, as early as we know, in the 13th century BCE. There was already an identified group of tribes called Israel. And we know from all these inscriptions and all these things that they formed the basis of a people that produced the literature that became the Hebrew Bible. And it's not that we have inscriptions that prove everything that's in the Bible, but there's so much, and I'm not giving you everything. There's so much there that puts the Bible in its context of where did these ideas come from? Where did they start? Even if the texts are edited later or written down later, here is where it all begins.
They didn't make up all these people. That's, to me, the fascinating thing. That these were real people mentioned in other sources other than the Bible.
Well, we don't have mention of Abraham, we don't have mention of Isaac or Jacob or Joseph or Moses. I mean, there's a large number of what we consider important that we have no other outside proof on, so to speak. But when you get down into the later texts, into the period of the kings and so on, you see, and again, there are numerous ones that I've not given you that mention the kings of Judea and Israel, in addition to the evidence within the land itself, like the bullae and various other things. And this, to me, is amazing stuff. Yes, Thelma.
What's the date of the Exodus?
The date of the Exodus?
I mean, what's
13th, traditionally dated around 1230 BCE, but we don't know. Because we're not even sure it happened in any way the way it's described in the Torah.
nothing in the Egyptian?
No, the Egyptians don't mention anything, which, they wouldn't probably do anyway. But we've not found necessarily archaeological evidence. It's one of the great mysteries. Because it becomes so important to later Israelite history and ideology. It's hard to believe that nothing happened, but what exactly happened, we really don't know. Well, thank you very much. And I'll take any other questions.